Hello and welcome to DBT Coalesce 2022. My name is Randy Pitcher. I'm here to introduce these two fine, wonderful folks who I've had the pleasure of chatting with the last few minutes for their talk, Navigating Data Consolidation After M&A. First, who am I? I'm a solutions architect at DBT Labs, but that's not important. The thing that is important is that Jacob Adler and Cameron Lichtenstein are here. I'm going to go ahead and let them do their own intros as per their requests. But before we jump in, okay. Someone asked if I was, said make sure to unmute. And I thought I was muted the whole time. That would have been hilarious. Okay, so like a couple housekeeping things. If you're watching live or in person, whatever, and you're not on the DBT community Slack, please, that is the most valuable thing you can do this entire week. Just go ahead and sign up. That's at getdbt.com/community. And the channel that we'll be using for the discussion is Coalesce Navigating Data Consolidation. Go in there. Please, talk is encouraged. Cross-chat is encouraged. Memes, jokes, please. Also, after the session, they'll be available. Cameron and Jacob will be available to take questions for further discussion in Slack, so you definitely want to get in there. So enough from me. Let's get it started. Over to you, Jacob and Cameron.
Awesome. Thank you. Good morning, Coalesce. I'm Cameron. This is Jacob. We'll be talking to you this morning about navigating data consolidation after an M&A or merger or acquisition. So quick intros, this is us, and we have an honorary third member of this presentation out in the Slack this morning. Just shout out to Oscar, who is super core in the project we'll talk about when Dutchie, the company that I currently work at, acquired 2 companies last year. So quick overview of the presentation. We'll go into some background on Dutchie and the acquisitions. We'll get into a few different phases of how we kind of tackled this project of data consolidation. We'll wrap with some conclusions. So you're going through a merger and acquisition. First of all, congratulations. That's usually a good thing. But what does that mean, right? I kind of want to get to the heart of that. You can go to the dictionary, or you can go, in this case, to Investopedia, see what they have to say. And if you look that up, what you'll see is that usually it's the consolidation or the merger acquisition of companies means that they combine their business transactions or their financial assets in some kind of way. They usually do it to increase efficiencies or reduce costs. And if you're lucky, you might even find some synergies here and there. So that's pretty cool. But beyond that, right, what does that mean for all of us here at Coalesce this morning as data practitioners? Well, we thought about it in our experience and came up with a few things. And for us, as a data practitioner, going through a merger and acquisition, it means that much of your existing reporting is going to become stale or incomplete pretty much overnight as soon as those papers are signed. It also means that the truth, quote unquote, is now going to exist in multiple places. And that's usually something that we actively try to avoid. And it also means that you're going to be asked to fix it, right? And fixing it here is kind of a loaded term. It's like, what does that even mean? And beyond that, one thing that we really want to kind of drive home this morning is that the M&A process is going to throw you kind of way more curveballs than you probably anticipated. And that many of those are not even going to involve the sort of technical work of consolidating the data itself. And so we'll get into a lot more detail on that. So just to kind of like summarize, going through an M&A means that the severity and the volume of the problems or the issues that you'll encounter are going to require a lot more attention from you as a data practitioner than your kind of standard data consolidation project. And so this morning, what we hope to share is kind of our experience going through this, some questions that we asked ourselves, and maybe some hot tips and recommendations that you can take away with you if you find yourself in this situation. So first, a little background on Dutchie and the acquisitions. So Dutchie is the company that I work at. Jacob and Oscar they've moved on, but we all worked on this at Dutchie. We're a software company in the cannabis industry, and with a mission to provide safe and easy access to cannabis for everybody. So we were founded in 2017. We raised the Series D last year and had these acquisitions. We've got over 5,000 customers across the US and Canada. Today we deploy several pieces of the modern data stack. So you probably recognize a lot of the logos in this diagram here. Quick background on the acquisitions. Dutchie itself was originally just an e-commerce company. So we would take orders online, kind of like a Grubhub or a DoorDash or something. And we would send those off to dispensaries to their point of sale machines. And so with the acquisition of Greenbits and LeafLogix last year, those are the two companies we acquired. They were companies who were also in this cannabis space, but they were primarily point of sale providers. LeafLogix also had an agricultural kind of ERP system as well, kind of like a seed to sale is what they called it. And so with the acquisitions, the goal was to kind of move toward a more fully vertically integrated offering. So last year, we released a unified POS, and this year, a payments product, all kind of on that mission. And so some background or quick overview on the data architecture, like very simplified view. Basically, you've got three separate companies here with three separate, similar but like differing stacks, right? You might recognize some similar logos like Zendesk or Salesforce using some similar tools. But with the kind of core, production infrastructure, we had MongoDB and AWS, as opposed to some of the other companies had MySQL or SQL Server running in Azure or their own kind of setup. And so what that presented for us was, given separate systems and different architectures, we had to consolidate this stuff. And so we had to ask ourselves, what are the options that you have when you find yourself in this situation? We've narrowed it down to three buckets, three kind of options or techniques. So you can merge data natively in production, you can integrate your data across different applications, or you can abstract data using tools like dbt. That's kind of like why we're all here this morning, is talk about dbt. We'll get into that. They all have their own kind of pros and cons. Merging data is usually ideal. It means that you're going to put all the data in a single database or a single set of tables. That's typically best if you're consolidating business processes, or if you've got applications that really rely on things being in the same database. Integration is maybe a good short to medium term solution. Sometimes that's all you need, is just systems to talk to each other. Great example is like a sales team selling different products out of different CRMs. And then lastly, that abstract option, which is where dbt really excels, which is combining disparate data sources and being able to roll them up into one. And so back to our diagram here, we were actually doing, before the acquisitions, going into the acquisitions, we were actually doing some integration, which is kind of that middle option. We're all, companies in this kind of cannabis space taking orders. And so what we had was, an e-commerce order would come in on Dutchie, and we would send it to LeafLogix or send it to Greenbits via some integrations we built. And so what that meant after the acquisitions is that all of a sudden we had a bunch of duplicate order data scattered about. We had to kind of make sense of that. On top of that, the way that we defined and kind of handled locations or customers was slightly different, whether that be in a Mongo collection on the Dutchie side, or kind of your standard normalized set of tables in MySQL or SQL Server. But more or less, all of which is to say, we had separate companies, tracking these core kind of business objects in different ways. And the ask to us as the data team at Dutchie was to provide a clear, unified view of all of this. And so this is where we landed our kind of reporting architecture at the end of the project, and that's kind of where it sits today. This probably looks familiar to many of you. We've got some separate data sources across these different companies, and even like a Salesforce and a Jira and a Zendesk, all being piped into a centralized warehouse, in our case, Snowflake. We are transforming data with dbt, and we got a nice BI tool on top in the way of Looker. And we'll kind of talk about how we got to this eventual state. But what we also want to talk about this morning is that the things that an M&A layers on top of all of these kind of challenges, right? So you've got your technical stuff where you're kind of building or consolidating down to a unified view, but there's going to be a lot of the curveballs that I mentioned that you're going to have to tackle. And so I'll pass it over to Jacob, who's going to kind of start talking about the different phases we went through.
Thanks, Cameron. All right. So now we're going to chat about a few things that we did in the wake of these transactions closing. So not the real message, but we have our very important stakeholder here and asking for, hey, can we get some metrics, asking things about timelines, feasibility, data quality, et cetera. So at this point, we really have more questions than answers. And so the next couple of slides, we're going to show you some questions that, being a data practitioner, you probably already know to ask. But knowing what we know in hindsight, we have some questions that, due to the complexity of M&A, we think you may benefit from as well. So the first thing that we needed to do is figure out who we should be partnering with. But it wasn't as straightforward as we would have thought. There was a lot of Slack redirection. There was a data analyst who wasn't really a data analyst. And it turns out that our best points of contact were a product manager and a DBA. So no direct counterparts here. And as we started with some of these intro meetings, we were definitely really excited about these data projects. And that energy wasn't exactly reciprocated. Cameron hinted there could be a lot of tension in these situations. And with hiring slowed down, more work thrown out of people's plates, it could be understandable that people don't want to be assigned new work for something that may not even be their main job. Once we figured out who the right cross-functional partners were, we need to understand what tools are we using, what are we using them for, and how many key dashboards were built in each. Looking team by team, one was using MySQL, AWS QuickSight, Metabase, and Salesforce. Another was using SQL Server with some external facing Looker dashboards for clients. And on the e-commerce side, as Cameron said, Snowflake DBT and an internal facing Looker. And with Snowflake and internal facing Looker not really having overlapping contracts or competition from these other business units, we quickly knew that the long-term home for our data would be in those tools. But even though we avoided the Redshift, BigQuery, Snowflake, Looker, Tableau, Holy Wars, we still had to be careful about word choice, how we were communicating, the role of these tools. Now, I was still surprised when someone got really animated the first mention of Snowflake, even though they hadn't necessarily used it before. So now we know who to partner with, we know where we can pull data from, and it's time to dig into existing reports and audit the metric definitions. And normally, if you're dealing with just one company's data, there could be more than one reasonable definition for a metric, and you're free to choose whichever you'd like, because in the closed world, you can get away with it. But now we have 3 companies. Maybe all 3 were using reasonable definitions for their business, but if we want apples to apples comparisons, we need one definition. So you need to have that conversation, and maybe you find your preferred definition, but you don't have the data to support it right now, and you need to work up to it. And let's look at an example. So customer churn, every SaaS company is tracking how many customers leave the business each month. And we have on the bottom left side of the slide a table showing how each business unit was tracking. So 2 of them were tracking in a CRM, HubSpot, and Salesforce. That's good. We have another that was using a spreadsheet. In terms of whether we were counting at the date of cancellation or the last date of service, well, all 3 were looking at the last date of service. That's good. It was consistent. And then in terms of which customers are eligible to count towards churn versus another metric like cancellations, well, all 3 were looking at active customers, which is good. However, we're seeing that one business unit was saying, well, if someone churns within the first 30 days, we're going to call that a different metric. And so we need to do a little bit of a restatement there. So we have a ton of data within reach. We're feeling so-so about data quality, about presentation. And so there's naturally a question of when's the appropriate time to share something. And let's say that you were hired to set up a modern data stack for a company. You probably have some sort of legacy or manual reporting that you can rely on as a crutch until your new reports are ready enough. Good examples at my current company, Future, where we're most of the way in a migration from Redshift to Snowflake and Looker. And there's one dashboard that's crucial to day-to-day operations, and we wanted to make sure it was 100% ready before doing a cutover. But we didn't have the luxury at Dutchie because there just wasn't enough legacy reporting for the desired metrics. And so we sent out a spreadsheet. It was pretty basic. We had key metrics across each business unit, but it was effective, right? It felt like the tip of the iceberg because through the process of preparing the report, process of just looking at the initial numbers that we were able to put together, we're able to quantify areas of opportunity within the business, like having a huge backlog of POS clients waiting to be onboarded and being able to provide evidence of some pretty serious data quality issues. Okay, so this section was about learning. And what did we learn? For one, we didn't have direct counterparts that were able to spend as much time working on this stuff as we were. And now all of a sudden, we had one data analyst, one data engineer for a 400-person company. We learned that there wasn't much objection to Snowflake and Looker being the eventual home of our combined data stack, but there definitely was a lot of work that we needed to do to get the data ready for DBT. And that largely included cleaning up our customer data and getting everyone onto one CRM. And in the meantime, we could support this manual spreadsheet process, but it just wasn't the ideal end state for us, wasn't the ideal end state for our stakeholders either. So let's look at our data architecture. So on the e-commerce side, things are relatively untouched. We're going into Snowflake, DBT, and Looker. For Greenbits, we have some support reporting in Metabase, some financial reporting in Salesforce. And for Leaf Logics, we have some external facing Looker reports that we were able to use. And we have this spreadsheet on the right-hand side, and we were just plucking, abstracting, copy pasting metrics from these reports onto one page to make it centralized for the audience. So now that we learned what we needed to learn and we understood where we wanted to go, we're going to review some of the intermediary work to set things up. So back to our very important stakeholder here, definitely felt some appreciation from the leadership team. Hey, this is a lot better than what we had before, but when's this going to be on a dashboard? And when can we drill a little bit more accurately into some of the metrics? And he said, hey, we're working on that. So every startup I've worked at, someone warns you early on that there's going to be data quality issues. And for young companies, that's fairly commonplace. But usually you're able to get what you need. And here, what complicated things was, as Cameron said, we have overlapping customers, overlapping orders. And so stakeholders are asking us for deduplicated numbers that we just couldn't estimate because the data was too siloed, even though we had integrations. It just wasn't as simple as A plus B plus C because we needed to subtract the overlap to get to the true number. And we knew that having one combined customer data set would help, but the data was just too messy to do that. So we had 2 enablement projects last summer. First, our accounting team did a subscription by subscription, invoice by invoice audit of POS customers so we could restate histories as accurately as we could. Then, I mentioned in our last section that our onboarding and implementation data was kind of messy. We had a spreadsheet and it had maybe 30 people making manual edits daily. There wasn't really any data validation, so there were a lot of typos and misspellings. And there were some columns that were doing the work of 3 or 4. And one thing to note here is if you point out the issues and you point out how to fix them, well, we were asked to do the fixing. And so that's what we did. We oversaw the cleanup for a few weeks in the summer. So now that we have the data ready for the CRM, and our Salesforce admin, Ali, did a fantastic job making a consolidated Salesforce instance that could support the combined sales teams. But, while it's totally common for some teams to build their own bespoke workflows in the CRM, well, now we had multiple sales, multiple customer success teams that each had their own specifications. And that puts timelines at risk. When you have this many people who can delay the goal of everyone using Salesforce, there's just a much greater chance that there's one person in the way. And a great example was someone who really did want to move their team onto Salesforce, but was just worried they were going to lose a lot of capabilities from HubSpot. And they said, hey, these capabilities are all on the Salesforce roadmap, but they're just really far into the future. Is there anything that we can do to speed those up? And let's take a step back and chat about why we needed to merge CRMs in the first place. So we already knew from the last section that the data was too messy to abstract. And then there's the question of, does each team keep selling through their own CRMs and we'll pass them information back and forth, or do we have one CRM for everyone? And in our case, the business process was changing. We combined sales teams, we were doing a ton of cross-selling, and so merging was definitely the right call for us. So now we spent all this time preparing the data, and we want to actually get it into Snowflake and do something with it. And this is a good spot for teams to pause, confirm that our tooling processes are still good fits for new data sources. In this case, we were lucky that everything could just go into Fivetran, but other teams may need to spin up Stitch, Meltano, Airbyte, etc., depending on their use case. And like with the Salesforce example, we saw timelines as a big risk. Whereas when we first bought Fivetran, our CTO, senior staff engineer were in the room. But now we were working with a bunch of people who had not worked with Fivetran and needed a little bit of selling. And that's totally understandable. If you were in charge of production, of stewarding production data, and you hadn't heard of tools like this before, I'd want some convincing too. And so we did eventually secure everyone's buy-in. It just took a lot longer than we would have liked. We asked for the first time in March 2021, and we didn't get everything in Snowflake until September 2021. So let's recap. So we wanted to get all of the customer data into Salesforce, but first we needed to do some cleanup in the meantime. And once Salesforce was live, we had to actually get people to use it to get the full benefit. And once we did that, that's when we focused on ingesting data into Snowflake. So looking back at our data architecture, we have our e-commerce data in the same spot, Snowflake, DBT, Looker. We have Greenbits, Leaf Logics, and Unified data now going into Snowflake. It's just not going into DBT or Looker just yet. And so now I'm going to pass it off to Cameron to take it from here and talk about the fun stuff with DBT.
Cool. Thanks, Jacob. Yeah, so I get the fun part. The next phase of the project is, we call it the build phase. So now that we've got all these kind of pipelines and kind of prep work done, back to our very important stakeholder, they're stoked, but now, of course, they want to see some metrics. In this case, like unified customer counts or unified revenue. And when can they see that stuff on a dashboard or in like a BI tool so that they can work with it and kind of take it moving forward? And so for us, we were a small team. At the very beginning of the presentation, I showed you there were 3 of us, and there really were only 3 of us working on this at that time. And so, we had just closed the acquisitions. We more than tripled the headcount of the organization. We more than 10x the amount of kind of data sources flowing through. And so we basically had a mountain of data to process or to kind of work our way through. So we had to come up with a sustainable way to deliver on this, deliver some early wins. For us, we came up with a kind of 3-step process, prioritizing the highest level, highest priority KPIs first for the org or for the new org, develop them out. So actually like build the models and kind of put the reports together. And then very importantly, I think, hand it off to somebody else in the org, whether it be like a, subject matter expert or stakeholder, somebody who can kind of take it and run with it so that we can get back to kind of step 1, rinsing and repeating, and just burning down this like mountain of data. So getting into the first step, prioritizing the top level KPIs, you'll always have to ask yourself this question. I'm sure that we all are familiar with this. What's the highest priority thing I can be working on at any given time? And so for a project like this, customer count, churn, revenue metrics like ARR or GMV, followed by something like contraction or expansion. And though we love our friends on product, that button color A/B test result is probably going to have to wait until we've got the other things sorted out. And so that's kind of what we did. And in an M&A, situation, it's not just asking what's the highest priority things that we want to be able to report on. It's what's the highest priority things are we going to have access to today, and then also in maybe 3 months from now and 6 months from now as more sources come online and more pipelines are set up. So it's a bit of a prioritization within prioritization kind of framework here that you'll have to kind of be aware of and ask yourself. So once you have that sorted out, then it's the fun part, and this is where DBT comes into play. So back to our kind of choose your own adventure matrix here. DBT was the obvious choice for us as the data team to be able to own and kind of deliver some early wins, right? We didn't have to depend on engineering or any other tool owners to put together some data models and start to show early kind of visibility on key metrics. And that's really where DBT shines, is that ability. And one quick example where it really came in clutch for us. This is also a quick shout out to David Wallace out in the Slack community this morning. We had just closed the acquisitions, and we had customer data that we had to ingest. And this customer data was distributed across, I think, over 25 different servers. And to make matters a little more complicated, that customer data was duplicated between some servers, and it was also moving around because there were some migrations happening. And so it's a moving target as we're trying to get to a state where we can just report on things. And so your typical project, you might be familiar with, because of the top image here on the slides, you got a source table, and maybe you create a staging model, maybe a few intermediate models, and then a mart model to report out, to on a BI tool or something. For us, in this particular case, just to get to that step 1, we had to basically loop through all of these different servers, intelligently union all of the data, deduplicate it, run it through some logic just to make sure that it's cleaned up, and then we get our single kind of base model that we can take from there and do what you would normally do. DBT really shined here because we were able to write a macro, pretty hairy macro with a bunch of Jinja in it to basically loop through all of those things and dynamically, unify columns and things. So that was a big win for us. And then lastly, step 3 of this is kind of creating that awareness and handing things off. And so this is, something you'll always normally probably do is socialize what you've built, find the people, the relevant stakeholders who want to or should know about it. But for a merger and acquisition project, there's going to be additional nuances and limitations of the data that are going to kind of potentially throw you some curveballs, right? So for us, for example, because we didn't have foreign keys linking for example, the order data going into the acquisitions. When stakeholders would come to us and ask, hey, can we drill into this, or can we cut this data by this or that dimension? Unfortunately, the answer was no, and we had to communicate the nuances there as to why. Moving forward, the answer may be yes, but historically we've got some limitations, and that's just something that you're probably going to run into, and so just be aware of as you work through these challenges. So to recap on our phase 3 here, ship the data marts and build the dashboards, right? It's kind of like do the work, the actual technical work of developing things out. So for us, we had an overwhelming amount of data with a small team, and using DBT, we were able to deliver some early wins on some pretty ambitious timelines, which was awesome. We, I would say fortunately in this case, had a small team. There's only 3 of us. And so what that enabled us to do was collaborate really closely, so that as we were developing things out, we kept the naming schemes for all of the different models we were doing, consistent, the definitions, the field names, all those things, so that when it came time to pull reporting, that what we built or what was being shown in reports kind of was consistent across the 3 new companies. And we kept everybody informed as best we could on the incremental updates, the incremental kind of things that we shipped along the way. And that was really big in building early trust and early confidence in the project as we got those early wins. So another quick overview on the reporting architecture. You've seen this before, so this is a refresher. We've got our 3 separate companies with all the different disparate data sources. We've got some unified sources all going into the centralized warehouse, the Snowflake warehouse, transformed and modeled in DBT, now piping into Looker. Everybody's happy, more or less. Big win. It's cool. So in conclusion, there's not going to be a single silver bullet answer to every project like this. And so, for us, what we wanted to do was share kind of the challenges and, the different things that we went through in hopes of, just giving you some awareness of what you might encounter. So, in your scenario, consider whatever makes the most sense, whether it's a merge, an integration, or an abstract with a DBT. Sometimes, one choice will be better than the other. The other thing we, kind of observed is that a lot of the challenges we worked through were very similar to your classic kind of normal data projects, but with a twist, right? So that's what an M&A is going to bring to the table, are some potentially unknown unknowns. And that's kind of the advice here, is just to keep your eyes and ears open for those things that may throw you for a loop if you're not prepared. It's going to be a little painful in the short term, but we think that, with this awareness and hopefully with some hot tips that we shared this morning, that you'll be able to kind of work through them a little better and deliver some big wins. So thanks for everybody for listening, and yeah, take it from here.
Hey everyone, how cool was that? First, Cameron and Jacob, thank you very much. That was an exceptional presentation. I've seen a lot of these, and this one was fantastic. Also, thanks to Jack in the control room, who's been keeping this running smoothly. Appreciate that. For everyone else on the call, after this, if you'd like to continue the discussion, there's been a couple really cool questions in the chat. Again, please join Coalesce Navigating Data Consolidation in our DBT community Slack.